So I'm going to tell you about me, and in some other presentations I'm going to really tell you a lot about the Prohibition era and also Al Capone himself. But we'll start with who I am. This is my family tree. If you see at the very top, Gabriel and Teresa Capone that you saw from the last slide that I had up there are the parents of Alphonse Capone. Their firstborn son, Vincenzo, and the second-born child, Raphael or Ralph, were both born in Italy. And my grandmother, Teresa, was pregnant with Frank when they came over on the ship Vera, and they went through Ellis Island, and that was in 1894. Alphonse became her fourth child, but it was the first child that was conceived and born in America. And all of the hopes and dreams and the reasons for them to leave their safe haven in Italy and come to America rested in his eyes. The other children, were all born later, and they only had one girl, and that was Mafalda. She was named after a princess in Italy, but there was only one girl. Now, if you look under my grandfather, you'll see my grandfather only had one child. That was my father. His name was Ralph Gabriel Capone. There's a very exact naming device that Italians use, and when a child is born, it's named after the grandfather or the father. In my father's case, of course, his first name was from his father, and his second name was from his grandfather. If you look at this family tree, you'll see me right underneath my father. You'll see something that's very strange, very unusual for an Italian immigrant family. There's not that many children. And I'll explain the reason why as we go along. I was born, as I said, on January 25th, 1940. Al Capone had just gotten out of prison, and when he got out of prison, he was very ill. I'll tell you a story about Al Capone. Al Capone was convicted of income tax evasion in 1931, and it was really a monkey trial. When the income tax law was first written here in the United States of America, it had a provision in the law that you did not have to declare any income that you earned illegally, because that would be against the Fifth Amendment. It would tend to incriminate oneself. So because of all the money that my grandfather and my uncle made were considered illegal, they did not think that they had to put it on their income tax, and they had no other income, so why even follow income tax? They got my grandfather first for the same amount of money for the same years. My grandfather got sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. Then they went after Al Capone. They wanted to get rid of the Capone boys, and so they got rid of Al Capone. They got him for income tax evasion also, but he got sentenced to 11 years. He was filing for an appeal, and his appeals were turned down when he was in Cook County Jail. Finally, he ran out of appeals, and they sent him then to Atlanta, where he was then filing for something called a writ of habeas corpus. What that means is a prisoner who is imprisoned has the right to say he was wrongfully imprisoned because he's got new evidence, and then he would be taken back to the judge that convicted him and the jury and present this new evidence. Al Capone was 1 day away from being taken from Atlanta back to Cook County, Chicago, Illinois, to show this new evidence. When J. Edgar Hoover called the first warden of Alcatraz, and he said, if you want the world to know this horrible place that Alcatraz is, transfer Al Capone out there, because then all the newspapers worldwide will cover that he has been transferred out there. I go out to Alcatraz several times a year. They sell my book in the bookstore, and I go out there and I sign books. You have to get on a ferry boat, and then they take you out to the island. It's actually an island. And the last sign that you see before you get on the ferry boat is a quote by the first warden of Alcatraz, Warden Johnston. And he is quoted as saying, "Alcatraz was open to incarcerate irredeemable men, men who could never return back to society." That certainly was not Al Capone.